a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times and it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
Imagine discovering that the Bible you have trusted your entire life might not tell the entire story. Not because parts were accidentally lost over time, but because the story itself may have been deliberately reduced. Far beyond the attention of most of the world, hidden among the rugged mountains of Ethiopia, generations of monks guarded something extraordinary. Within the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church rested an ancient Bible, unlike the one most people know today. Instead of 66 or 73 books, it contained 81. Inside those additional books were visions of layered heavens, mysterious accounts of angels, and descriptions of Jesus that seemed strikingly different from the familiar narrative. If uncovering forgotten history, ancient mysteries, and hidden truths fascinates you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week, we explore remarkable discoveries and long-lost stories that challenge what we think we know. Now, let's continue. For centuries, people have wondered whether prophets could truly receive messages from beyond the limits of ordinary human experience. Could someone glimpse the future? Could revelations travel across time and space? Throughout history, seers and prophets claimed they could. Most people dismissed those stories as legends, yet some ancient texts preserved in Ethiopia appeared to tell those stories with remarkable detail. Years later, as filmmaker Mel Gibson prepared to create the long-awaited sequel to The Passion of the Christ, he found himself facing an unexpected problem. He was not simply searching for dramatic material. He wanted to understand the resurrection more deeply, but something about the traditional account seemed unfinished. The more he studied early Christian writings, the stronger that feeling became. It was as though pieces of the story had vanished. Entire chapters of history appeared to exist in one tradition while being completely absent from another. Following those missing pieces led him away from Rome and toward a place few people ever considered, Ethiopia. The trail, however, had begun much earlier. Hidden within the book of Acts is a brief encounter that many readers pass without much thought. Yet that single moment quietly changed the beginning of Christian history. On a lonely desert road, a powerful Ethiopian official rode inside his chariot while reading from the scroll of Isaiah. This was no ordinary traveler. He served under the Kandake, the queen of the Aksumite kingdom. Kandake was not the queen's personal name, but a royal title, much like Pharaoh in Egypt or Caesar in Rome. The man possessed enormous authority, yet despite his position, he struggled to understand the words before him. As his chariot moved across the desert, the Apostle Philip noticed him. Running alongside, Philip began explaining the prophecy contained in Isaiah. Their conversation continued until the Ethiopian official accepted the message of Christ. This was not a legend added centuries later. The account appears directly within the New Testament itself. That simple fact carries enormous significance. One of the earliest recorded people to embrace Christianity was not a Roman or a Greek, but a high-ranking official from Ethiopia. Long before church councils debated Scripture, before bishops argued over which books belonged in the Bible, Ethiopia had already entered the Christian story. That historical detail makes another fact impossible to ignore. Today, the Protestant Bible contains 66 books. The Catholic Bible includes 73. Several Eastern Orthodox traditions recognize even more. Yet the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserves 81 books as Holy Scripture. 15 additional books. That raises an unavoidable question. If Ethiopia had been part of Christianity from the very beginning, and if it faithfully preserved a larger collection of sacred writings, why did much of the Christian world eventually settle on a shorter version? The answer becomes even more intriguing when history moves forward into the 4th century. During that period, King Ezana officially converted the kingdom of Aksum to Christianity. Almost simultaneously, Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity within the Roman Empire. Two powerful empires accepted the same faith during the same century, yet they did not preserve the same Bible. Rome gradually embraced a shorter collection of books. Ethiopia continued preserving many more. Why? History has never offered a simple answer. As researchers compare the two traditions, the differences become increasingly difficult to overlook. The Ethiopian Canon preserved writings that many Christians have never encountered. Among them are 1st Enoch, Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Ethiopian Maccabees. These texts do not merely add extra stories. They present a broader framework for understanding the relationship between heaven, angels, humanity, and God's interaction with the world. One example is the Book of Jubilees. Rather than portraying angels as distant beings watching events unfold from heaven, Jubilees presents them as active participants in human history. They appear during important moments when covenants between God and humanity are established, almost like official witnesses ensuring that every condition is clearly understood and faithfully observed. In this version of the story, heaven does not remain far away. It is deeply involved in the events unfolding on earth. Divine beings observe, witness, and participate in ways that differ from the understanding many readers have grown accustomed to. The result is not merely an expanded version of Genesis, but a vision of reality in which heaven and earth remain closely connected, with spiritual forces playing an active role in the lives of humanity. As the centuries passed, history reached a remarkable turning point. During the 4th century, two great empires embraced the same faith almost simultaneously. In the kingdom of Aksum, King Ezana officially accepted Christianity, transforming his empire into one of the earliest Christian kingdoms in the world. Around that very same period, far to the north, Emperor Constantine led the Roman Empire down the same path. At first glance, the two stories seem almost identical. Two powerful rulers, the same century, the same religion. Yet history took them in completely different directions. As generations passed, Rome gradually settled on a smaller collection of sacred writings, while Ethiopia continued preserving many more. One tradition narrowed its canon, the other refused to let go of what it had inherited. No one has ever fully explained why those paths separated. The deeper historians compare the two traditions, the more difficult the differences become to ignore. Within Ethiopia's collection survived books that many Christians have never even encountered. Among them were 1st Enoch, Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Ethiopian Maccabees. These were not simply additional stories tucked onto the end of Scripture. Together they presented a far broader picture of how heaven and earth interacted. One book in particular stood out. The Book of Jubilees described a world where heaven remained deeply involved in human history. Angels were not distant beings watching events unfold from somewhere beyond the stars. They participated directly in the relationship between God and humanity. Whenever covenants were established, the angels appeared almost like official witnesses, ensuring every command, every promise, and every responsibility was perfectly understood. The world described in Jubilees felt disciplined, ordered, and constantly observed. One example revealed just how different this tradition could be. According to Jubilees, anyone who knowingly violated the Sabbath was to be cut off from the community. That punishment meant complete separation from the people, treating the offender as though they no longer belonged. In some passages, the consequence became even more severe, extending to death itself. For modern readers, that picture can feel startling. It presents a reality where divine law is enforced with extraordinary seriousness. Suddenly, Jubilees no longer feels like an expanded version of Genesis. Instead, it opens the door to a world where heaven actively governs life on earth with precision and authority, leaving very little room for uncertainty. Yet the deeper the ancient writings go, the stranger the story becomes. Most people grow up hearing a familiar explanation for the beginning of evil. A serpent enters the Garden of Eden, tempts Eve, and through human disobedience, sin enters the world. The Ethiopian tradition, especially in the Book of Enoch, tells that story from a very different perspective. Instead of beginning with a single serpent, it introduces a carefully organized rebellion. According to the text, powerful heavenly beings known as the Watchers deliberately abandoned the place assigned to them in heaven. Their descent was no accident. It was a decision. The book even records the names of some of these figures, including Samjaza and Ayazel. Knowing they were forbidden to leave their heavenly station, they crossed the boundary anyway and entered the human world. They did so with a purpose. They desired to live among humanity, take human wives, and share knowledge that people had never been meant to possess. When they arrived, they brought far more than their presence. According to the text, Ayazel taught humanity the craft of war, swords, knives, shields, armor, weapons that transformed conflict forever. In this version of history, warfare is not a gradual human invention born through centuries of experimentation. It enters civilization as forbidden knowledge delivered from outside. Other Watchers revealed different kinds of secrets. They taught humanity how to work metals, manipulate natural materials, and develop skills capable of producing power and control. Alongside those practical abilities came teachings that encouraged vanity, comparison, and the desire to reshape outward appearance. Little by little, innocence disappeared. The clear boundary that once separated heaven from earth was broken. Into the human world came violence that spread without restraint, corruption that multiplied faster than it could be contained, and knowledge that changed civilization forever. The Book of Enoch leaves little room for ambiguity. Evil was not simply discovered. It was taught. It followed a structure. It entered humanity from beyond humanity itself. Understanding that perspective also helps explain why these writings survived at all. Ethiopia was protected by far more than faith. Its mountains, deserts, and isolated trade routes created natural barriers that made outside control extraordinarily difficult. Armies struggled to reach its monasteries, and distant church authorities found it nearly impossible to impose the same decisions that reshaped Christianity elsewhere. As church leaders in other regions debated which books belonged within Scripture, Ethiopia remained largely untouched. No imperial decrees arrived. No distant councils forced revisions. No officials appeared demanding that certain books disappear. While other traditions gradually shortened their collections, Ethiopian monks quietly continued preserving everything they had received. They understood what was at stake. Some committed entire books to memory, repeating every line until they could recite thousands of words without looking at a single page. If invaders ever destroyed the manuscripts, the books would continue living inside human minds. Others protected the physical manuscripts with extraordinary determination, hiding them deep within remote monasteries and isolated mountain sanctuaries where reaching them required dangerous journeys that few outsiders could survive. Generation after generation, they carried a single responsibility: to ensure that these ancient writings would outlive every threat that sought to erase them. The commitment of the Ethiopian monks reached astonishing levels. When danger approached, they refused to abandon the writings they believed had been entrusted to them. Instead, they wrapped fragile manuscripts in layers of cloth and carried them into the mountains. With nothing more than ropes in their hands, They climbed narrow cliff paths and pulled themselves up sheer rock faces where a single mistake could send them plunging to their deaths. Yet they accepted that risk because they believed the books were worth more than their own lives. Hidden inside caves and isolated monasteries, far beyond the reach of invading armies, the manuscripts survived where few people could ever find them. When you step back and look at the entire picture, one fact becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. In one remote corner of the world, a single Christian tradition preserved a version of the biblical story that much of the rest of Christianity gradually left behind. More importantly, what those preserved writings contain is not merely different. They are richer in detail, broader in scope, and in many places far more unsettling than the version most people have grown up reading. Then the story takes an unexpected turn. Among those forgotten writings is a book that seems to have disappeared from most modern Bibles, yet somehow never truly vanished. Its fingerprints remain hidden inside Scripture itself. Near the end of the New Testament sits the short book of Jude. Many readers pass through it without noticing anything unusual. But when they arrive at Jude 1:14-15, they encounter a passage that seems oddly familiar. It declares, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all." At first glance, it appears to be an ordinary statement. Yet biblical scholars have long recognized that these words are not original to Jude. They are taken directly from the opening chapter of 1 Enoch, where God is described arriving with countless heavenly beings to judge the earth and expose every act of wickedness. That realization creates an uncomfortable question. If a passage from 1 Enoch is quoted within the New Testament itself, then the influence of that book never truly disappeared. A text missing from most modern Bibles is still speaking through the pages that remain. That leaves an obvious question hanging in the air. How can a book be important enough to be quoted as Scripture, yet not important enough to remain part of the biblical collection? Searching for an answer brings the story back to one of the shortest and most mysterious figures in the book of Genesis. Enoch appears almost without warning. Scripture tells the reader only that he walked with God, and then God took him. The statement is brief, offering no explanation of what happened, where he went, or why he was chosen. Then the book of 1 Enoch steps into that silence. Rather than leaving the mystery unanswered, it transforms those few lines into an extraordinary journey. According to the text, Enoch is taken into heaven itself. There he witnesses a universe arranged in carefully ordered layers. He is shown where the winds originate, where the sun and moon travel along their appointed paths, and where the stars remain under divine command. As he moves through these heavenly realms, he encounters powerful spiritual beings who explain not only the condition of heaven, but also the corruption spreading across the earth, and the reasons judgment is approaching. The revelations do not end there. Another section of 1 Enoch returns to the story of the Watchers and describes the consequences of their rebellion in far greater detail. After descending to earth, these heavenly beings took human wives, and children were born from those unions. The text calls them the Nephilim. They are portrayed as giants of overwhelming strength, destructive beyond control. They consume enormous amounts of food, exhaust the earth's resources, turn violently against humanity, and plunge the world into chaos. Within this framework, the story of Noah's flood takes on an entirely different meaning. In Genesis, the flood is presented primarily as God's response to the growing wickedness of mankind. But 1 Enoch offers a more specific explanation. Humanity's corruption is only part of the problem. The Nephilim themselves have become the central crisis. The flood is therefore described not simply as punishment, but as a deliberate reset designed to remove beings that should never have existed in the first place. It is a strikingly different interpretation of one of the Bible's most familiar events. The similarities between 1st Enoch and later biblical writings become even more intriguing. One passage describes Azel, one of the rebellious watchers, being seized, bound in chains, and cast into darkness where he must remain until the day of judgment. When scholars compare that scene with the book of Revelation, they notice remarkable parallels. Revelation describes Satan being bound and thrown into the abyss before the final judgment. The language, the sequence of events, and even the structure of the two scenes appear strikingly similar. Because 1st Enoch predates the New Testament by centuries, those similarities naturally raise another question that scholars continue to debate. How much of the imagery found in the New Testament reflects ideas that were already present in ancient writings, which were later excluded from the biblical canon? The more scholars compared these ancient writings with the New Testament, the more a difficult question refused to disappear. How much of what appears in the New Testament was actually built upon ideas that already existed in writings later left outside the biblical canon? That question opened the door to something far larger than a debate over missing books. It began to reshape the way many people viewed Jesus himself. Deep within 1st Enoch, there appears a mysterious figure known as the Son of Man. He is not introduced as someone who suddenly arrives without warning at the end of history. Instead, he already exists before the final judgment begins. He occupies a throne of authority. Kings and nations stand beneath his power. The responsibility of judging the entire world belongs to him. What makes this especially remarkable is the age of the text itself. Scholars date these passages to somewhere between the 1st and 2nd centuries, BCE, generations before the birth of Jesus. That timeline changes the conversation. When researchers turn to the Gospels, they notice that Jesus repeatedly refers to himself using the very same title, the Son of Man. According to many biblical scholars, this was not simply a new expression that Jesus invented. Instead, it appears that he was identifying himself with a figure many people of his own time would already have recognized from writings such as 1st Enoch. The implication is striking. Rather than creating an entirely new identity, Jesus was presenting himself as the fulfillment of a role that had already been described centuries earlier. For some readers, that conclusion might seem like a later interpretation added long after Jesus lived. Then, archaeology entered the story. In 1947, a teenage shepherd wandered through the wilderness near the Dead Sea searching for a lost animal. Curious about a cave hidden among the cliffs, he threw a stone inside. Instead of hearing it strike the ground, he heard the unmistakable sound of breaking pottery. That single moment led to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. Inside the cave were ancient clay jars. Within those jars rested hundreds of manuscripts that had remained untouched for centuries. Among them were several copies of 1st Enoch, written in Aramaic and dating to a period before the time of Christ. The discovery carried another remarkable detail. The caves where those scrolls had been hidden lay less than 2 miles from the region where John the Baptist later preached. In other words, the ideas found within 1st Enoch were already circulating in exactly the same environment where the earliest Christian movement began. For anyone searching beyond the familiar biblical narrative, discoveries like these could not easily be ignored. They were precisely the kinds of writings Mel Gibson encountered as he continued exploring the earliest Christian traditions while preparing his next film. With every ancient manuscript he examined, the same realization seemed to grow stronger. The version of the story he had inherited no longer appeared to be the complete picture. Yet 1st Enoch only answered one part of the mystery. It described who Jesus was before history unfolded. Another ancient text attempted to describe something even more extraordinary, not simply who he was, but how he entered the world. Among the oldest surviving Christian writings stands a remarkable work known as The Ascension of Isaiah. Its story begins in a way few readers expect, not with a birth, not with a miracle, but with an execution. According to the account, the prophet Isaiah became the target of a king who viewed his visions as dangerous. Soldiers seized the prophet and carried out a horrifying sentence. They forced him inside the hollow trunk of a tree and sawed him in half while he was still alive. Within the tradition preserved by this text, Isaiah's death was no meaningless act of cruelty. He had spoken openly about a vision unlike anything people around him had ever heard. He claimed to have witnessed a figure descending from heaven itself, passing through unseen realms before entering the human world. If such a vision were true, it meant the powers governing the world were neither absolute nor secure. Something infinitely greater could move through their domain without their knowledge. To rulers determined to preserve their authority, that message represented a direct threat. Silencing Isaiah became more than punishment. It became an attempt to erase the vision itself. Yet before his execution, Isaiah had already seen what the text describes in extraordinary detail. He was lifted upward through a magnificent structure consisting of 7 distinct heavens. Each realm differed from the one beneath it. As he ascended, everything became increasingly brilliant, perfectly ordered, and filled with greater authority. Every level possessed its own hierarchy, its own inhabitants, and its own place within an immense heavenly system. Then, without warning, the direction of the vision changed. Instead of watching someone ascend, Isaiah witnessed a glorious figure known simply as the Beloved begin descending from the highest heaven. It was at that moment that the vision became unlike anything found in the familiar gospel accounts. As the Beloved entered each heavenly realm, he concealed his true identity. Rather than revealing himself, he took on the appearance of the beings who already lived there. In the realm of angels, he appeared as one of the angels. Passing into the next heaven, he blended seamlessly once again. Realm after realm, level after level, he continued downward without attracting attention. No heavenly being recognized who was moving through their midst. The descent remained hidden. Only after passing unnoticed through every layer of heaven did the Beloved finally arrive on earth, where he entered the human world through birth. According to the Ascension of Isaiah, the birth of Jesus was not the beginning of the story. It was the final step of a descent that had already begun long before anyone on earth realized it. As Isaiah continued watching the vision unfold, he noticed something extraordinary. The Beloved did not announce his arrival as he descended through the heavens. Instead, he concealed who he truly was. Each time he entered another level of heaven, he took on the appearance of the beings who lived there. When he entered the realm inhabited by angels, he appeared exactly as one of them. As he descended farther, the pattern never changed. Realm after realm, he blended perfectly into his surroundings, giving no indication of his true identity. The most remarkable part of the vision was that no one recognized him. Not a single being throughout the 7 heavens realized who was quietly passing through their domain. Hidden beneath the appearance of each realm, the Beloved continued descending unnoticed until his journey finally ended on earth, where he entered the world through human birth. Yet the text insists that this was anything but a peaceful journey. The lower heavens were not portrayed as empty spaces separating heaven from earth. They were described as occupied territory. According to the vision, Satan and the powers aligned with him were already active there, exercising influence within those unseen realms between the divine world and humanity.